The night was calm, or at least it seemed that way. The hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin as it soared through the midnight sky, heading towards its destination. It was a routine flight, the kind that passengers often forget as soon as they land. But for those aboard, this would not be just another trip. The plane was a long-distance commercial flight, packed with travelers on various journeys. Some were heading home, others were venturing to new places, and a few, like the man near the back of the cabin, were simply looking to escape the noise of life, even if just for a few hours. He sat quietly by the window, his eyes fixed on the dark void outside. He wasn't asleep, though his face gave that impression. The light from the overhead cabin lights bounced off his features, casting shadows that seemed to reflect the inner turmoil he kept hidden. The man had the kind of face that didn't invite conversation. No one paid him much attention, which was exactly how he wanted it. A flight attendant, young and eager to do her job, walked past his seat, her eyes scanning the aisle. She glanced at him and muttered something under her breath, but the words went unnoticed by him. He had heard far worse in his life. But as she passed, something in her demeanor shifted. She stopped in her tracks, looked back at him, and rolled her eyes. Without missing a beat, she approached the man, standing tall in front of him as if preparing to scold a child. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone sharp. "Could you please sit still? This isn't a bus. If you have a problem with your seat, there's nothing I can do." The words were blunt, but the implication was much worse. He wasn't a regular passenger to her, he was an inconvenience. A nuisance. A person who, in her eyes, didn't belong on this flight. The man didn't move, didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. He simply stared out the window, his expression unreadable. He was a man of few words, especially when words weren't necessary. There was no need to dignify her insult with a response. The flight attendant paused, expecting him to argue, to apologize, or perhaps to stand up and leave. When he did none of those things, she scoffed and walked away, muttering something under her breath. She didn't know it then, but that moment, her insult, was the catalyst for something she could never have predicted. The aircraft was far above the clouds now, crossing over vast expanses of ocean. There was nothing visible below except the dark, endless stretch of water and the occasional flicker of city lights far in the distance. It was supposed to be a peaceful flight. No turbulence, no interruptions. Just another night, another flight. But not tonight. Suddenly, the plane shuddered. A small jolt, barely noticeable at first, but it was enough to make some passengers look up from their magazines or phones. The flight attendants, too, straightened their eyes, scanning the overhead lights as they searched for any sign of what was happening. Then came another jolt, stronger this time. The plane lurched to the side, and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The lights flickered, casting shadows in the aisles. A soft buzz echoed from the cockpit, a sound that didn't belong in a plane flying this high. It was the kind of noise you only heard in emergency situations. The passengers around the man began to murmur nervously. Some clutched their armrests, while others exchanged uneasy glances. The flight attendants rushed down the aisles, trying to calm the situation, offering reassuring smiles that didn't quite mask the tension in their eyes. In the cockpit, the pilots exchanged frantic words, their voices barely audible through the comms. They had noticed the strange behavior of the plane as well. The control systems were responding erratically. Something wasn't right. The man near the back of the cabin remained still, his eyes still fixed on the window. But his mind was elsewhere, sharp, focused, calculating. He had noticed the same thing the pilots had, the way the plane seemed to shudder with each passing moment. He could feel it deep in his bones. This wasn't normal. For a brief moment, the man considered standing up, alerting the flight attendants to the severity of the situation. But he hesitated. What would they do? They would think he was just another nervous passenger. And why would they listen to someone who had been insulted just minutes before? But then the plane jolted again, and this time, it was worse. The noise from the cockpit grew louder, more urgent. The passengers screamed, their panic rising as they felt the plane lose altitude. One of the overhead compartments popped open, and bags tumbled out, adding to the chaos. Flight attendants rushed to secure the cabin, but it was becoming clear, the situation was spiraling out of control. The man stood. Without a word, he rose from his seat and moved toward the front of the plane. His movements were calm, deliberate, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. He didn't look at the flight attendants, who were frantically trying to maintain order. He didn't even look at the other passengers, whose faces were contorted in fear. He just walked forward. As he passed the flight attendants, one of them tried to stop him. She placed her hand on his arm, her voice shaky. "Sir, please return to your seat. There's nothing you can do. We're handling this." He didn't flinch, didn't even look down at her hand. His eyes remained fixed ahead. "I'm a pilot," he said, his voice low, steady. "And this plane needs me." The words were out before he could stop them, and for the first time, the flight attendants froze. Their eyes widened. The man wasn't just a passenger. He wasn't just the person they had insulted minutes ago. He was a pilot. But that didn't make the situation any less dire. In fact, it made it worse. The plane was in freefall. The control systems were failing, and the aircraft was descending rapidly. There was no time to waste. One of the flight attendants, her face pale, grabbed the intercom and attempted to communicate with the cockpit. The response was garbled, full of static. They couldn't make contact. It was too late for them to fix this. The man reached the cockpit door. He didn't knock, didn't wait for permission. He simply opened it, revealing the two pilots, both of them in a panic. One of the pilots looked up, startled. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and fear. The man didn't waste time explaining. He simply moved past the stunned pilots and sat at the controls. His hands flew over the switches and buttons, his experience guiding him through the process without hesitation. The plane had been in trouble before, but never like this. With a series of swift, practiced movements, he regained control of the aircraft. It wasn't easy. The plane fought him every step of the way, shaking and trembling as if trying to escape. But he fought back, focusing on every detail, every piece of information the instruments were feeding him. Minutes passed. The chaos in the cabin grew louder. The passengers, some of them sobbing, others praying, had no idea what was happening in the cockpit. They didn't know that their fate was being decided by a man they had insulted. They didn't know that their only chance at survival rested in the hands of a stranger, a pilot who had been overlooked, dismissed, and disrespected. But he didn't care about that. He wasn't doing this for them. He was doing this because he had a job to do. Because it was his responsibility. Because, above all, he knew how to survive. The plane began to stabilize, inch by inch. The rattling slowed, the alarms faded. But they were not out of danger yet. And the man still had one final challenge ahead of him, landing the plane. He wasn't sure if they would make it. He wasn't sure if he would make it. But there was no turning back now. The plane was still descending rapidly. The ground below was closer than it should have been. Would he be able to pull off a safe landing? And what secrets about this flight were hidden from everyone aboard? The plane shuddered again, this time with a violent tremor that sent a wave of panic through the cabin. Every passenger seemed to hold their breath in unison, waiting for the inevitable. The bright overhead lights flickered, casting unsettling shadows across the terrified faces around the cabin. In the cockpit, the man remained calm, his fingers moving over the controls with practiced precision. He could feel the plane's instability, the way it was resisting every effort to stabilize. The aircraft wasn't responding the way it should. Every correction he made seemed to be countered by the plane itself, like it had a mind of its own. But the man wasn't worried. Not yet. He had seen this before, countless times. The emergency procedures were second nature to him. There was still time, still a chance. His hands moved swiftly over the throttle and control yoke. The sounds of alarms and flashing warning lights were becoming a constant, but the man blocked them out. The only thing that mattered was the horizon, the invisible line where the plane would eventually touch the earth, hopefully, safely. Outside the cockpit window, the night sky was a dark blur. The ocean stretched endlessly below, an unfathomable mass of water that gave no clues about the terrain below. His heart raced, but it wasn't from fear. It was the adrenaline that coursed through his veins when he was doing what he did best, navigating a situation that seemed impossible. The passengers were still unaware of the full gravity of the situation. They felt the turbulence and the unnatural descent, but no one knew that a crisis was unfolding at the very front of the plane. They were just passengers, some clinging to hope, others on the brink of panic, and a few trying to remain calm. Flight attendants darted through the aisles, their faces pale with anxiety. The young woman who had initially insulted the man now walked past him with a wary glance, though she was careful not to acknowledge him. The reality had hit her, they were in the hands of a man they had underestimated. Her own mistake was now glaringly obvious. The cabin was filled with muffled sobs, murmurs of confusion, and the occasional scream. Some passengers tried to get up, but the seatbelt sign remained illuminated, keeping them restrained in their seats. Outside, the winds howled like a distant storm, and the plane bucked under the pressure. Every few seconds, the plane seemed to drop again, as if it had lost all control. Back in the cockpit, the man's mind raced through every procedure he knew. He glanced at the fuel levels. They were dangerously low. His eyes flicked to the altimeter. The altitude was dropping far too quickly. They were losing height, and the aircraft was fighting every step of the way. He made another adjustment to the yoke, feeling the plane shudder in response. The controls were barely responding. There was no time to waste. The ground was coming up too fast, and there was nothing he could do to slow the descent. His thoughts were interrupted by a crackling noise over the radio. For a moment, he thought it was just static. But then a voice, frantic and distorted, cut through the silence. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Flight 213, requesting emergency landing clearance. We are descending rapidly and cannot regain control. We need help. Please respond." It was the voice of one of the pilots. The man could hear the panic in his tone. But it was too late for help. The air traffic control tower was miles away, and they were already out of range for communication. The man knew the likelihood of receiving help was next to none. This was his fight now. And there was no one else. The urgency in the cockpit intensified. The man's pulse quickened, but he remained focused. His eyes never left the instruments. He had no time to look at the pilots beside him. They were useless now. They had already failed, and it was up to him to save them all. The first officer, a young man barely in his 30s, was gripping the armrests of his seat as if trying to anchor himself to reality. He looked at the man, his expression pleading for guidance. "What do we do? What's happening to the plane?" The officer's voice was barely audible over the noise of the alarms. His knuckles were white from gripping the armrests so tightly. The man's gaze flicked over to him, his face unreadable. "We're losing control of the plane. We have to act fast." He paused, his hands still working on the controls. "We don't have the luxury of time." He wasn't sure if they were even listening anymore. They were both on the verge of collapse. The pressure, the noise, the fear, it was all too much for them. But not for him. Not yet. The other pilot, the captain, was staring at the instruments, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had been a pilot for over a decade, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The descent continued, the plane rapidly losing altitude. The man's mind worked quickly, trying to calculate the best approach. His mind raced through the options. If he could just keep the plane steady for a few more moments, if he could hold on until they broke through the storm cloud layer, he might have a chance to land it. The plane's engines sputtered. A deep vibration rippled through the fuselage, rattling the windows. The man gripped the controls, trying to maintain the plane's balance. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, the roar deafening. And then, the worst happened. The lights flickered again, then went out completely. The cabin was plunged into darkness. "Stay calm," the man's voice cut through the panic. "We're going to get through this. Just stay calm." But the words felt hollow. The fear in the cockpit was palpable. He could hear the captain's breath catch in his throat, the first officer mumbling something incoherent. The emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow across the cabin. The aircraft was now barely holding together. The descent had become almost uncontrollable, and the man had no choice but to make a risky decision. He pulled back on the yoke with all his strength. The aircraft groaned, the engine sputtering as the plane seemed to protest every move he made. He could feel it, the weight of the aircraft pushing down, the sheer force of the descent. But there was one thing he knew for certain: if they kept this up, they would never make it. "We need to pull up," he said, his voice steady but firm. "If we don't, we won't survive." With all the power he had, he adjusted the flight controls, working against the plane's natural resistance. His hands burned with the effort, but he didn't stop. Every second counted. He could see it now, he could see the dark line of the ocean below, closer and closer with every passing second. There was no going back. The cabin was now in chaos. People screamed, clutching their seats, as the plane dipped and bucked. There was no telling how much time they had left. It was now or never. But the man didn't falter. His focus never wavered. The aircraft shuddered violently again, and the world seemed to spin as the plane veered into a sharp nosedive. He fought with every ounce of strength to keep it steady, feeling the pressure building in his chest as the ground below seemed to rise up to meet them. Then, in an instant, everything changed. The plane broke through the clouds. The horizon appeared before him, bathed in a dim, ghostly light. The dark sea stretched beneath, just a few hundred feet below. They were alive. But would they survive the landing? The plane was descending towards the water at a terrifying speed. There was no runway, no airstrip, only the cold, unforgiving ocean. The man gritted his teeth, determined to fight until the very last moment. Would he be able to bring them all to safety, or was this the final descent? The wind howled outside, a deafening roar that filled the cockpit. The man gripped the control yoke with a steady hand, his knuckles pale, every muscle tense. His eyes remained focused on the horizon, now just a blur of dark water and the faint glow of the emergency lights. The sea below was an endless, dark expanse, and the plane was still descending, rapidly. The aircraft had broken through the storm clouds and into a chilling, ominous sky. The horizon stretched out in front of him like a never-ending abyss. His heart raced, but his face remained impassive. There was no time for fear. No time for hesitation. "Get ready," he shouted to the pilots beside him. His voice was the only steady thing in the chaos that surrounded them. "Brace for impact. We're not out of this yet." The captain and the first officer stared at him, their faces a mixture of disbelief and desperation. Their bodies were rigid in their seats, their eyes wide with fear. Neither of them had the skill to land a plane in this condition, not with the instruments failing, not with the wind howling and the plane shaking like it was on the verge of falling apart. "We're losing it. We can't land," the captain shouted over the noise, his voice tinged with panic. He looked at the man, pleading. "What the hell do we do? This is impossible." The man didn't answer immediately. He didn't have time to. His eyes scanned the instruments, looking for any sign of life. There was nothing. The altimeter showed that they were just under 500 feet above the water, and the descent rate was still dangerously high. But he had no choice. He couldn't let them crash. Not now. Not like this. The plane lurched again, the right wing dipping sharply as if trying to buck them from the sky. His fingers tightened on the yoke as he fought to correct the plane's angle. The noise from the engines was deafening, a grinding, rattling sound that echoed through the cabin like a death knell. He could feel the tension in the cockpit, the desperation of the two pilots beside him, but he knew there was no room for panic. They needed him. He was their only hope. Steady, the man barked. His voice was firm, unyielding. I need you to trust me. The captain and first officer exchanged a glance, but neither said anything. The fear was visible in their eyes, but they knew, deep down, that they had no other choice. The man had taken control, and there was no turning back. The plane continued to drop. The sound of the wind and engines filled the air, a cacophony of noise that threatened to drown them all. There was nothing but the dark expanse of ocean below them, and the looming terror of what would happen if they couldn't stabilize the aircraft. The man's mind raced. He had only a few seconds to make a decision. The water was too close, the speed too high. If he didn't pull out of this dive, they would crash into the ocean, and the impact would be catastrophic. He had to find a way to slow their descent, to give them a chance. Without hesitation, he pushed forward on the yoke, increasing their speed, knowing that this might be their only chance to level out the aircraft. The plane shuddered as it responded, the engines roaring in protest. The rapid descent slowed just slightly, but the moment was fleeting. They were still falling. He glanced at the gauges again. The aircraft was under control, but just barely. The plane was coming in too steep, too fast. Hold on, the man yelled as he adjusted the throttles. He was aware of the fear that was beginning to spread through the cockpit, but he couldn't afford to show any weakness. He had to focus. They all had to focus. A moment later, the nose of the plane seemed to level out. The violent shaking eased for a brief moment. They were still descending, but at a more controlled rate. For a second, it felt like a victory. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The plane was still too close to the ocean. The man knew he didn't have much time. He had to make a split-second decision. The only option now was a controlled ditching, a maneuver that, if executed correctly, could save their lives. But it was risky. The plane wasn't designed for it, and with the control systems malfunctioning, it was a gamble. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but his movements were calm, precise. His hands moved over the throttles again, easing them back just a little more. The plane's descent slowed further, but the water was still too close. Too damn close. His gaze shifted to the cockpit window, watching the water grow closer with every passing second. The dark, roiling sea was almost upon them. His mind raced with calculations. The angle, the speed, the wind, they all had to be perfect. You need to prepare, the man shouted at the two pilots. His voice was intense. Get ready to brace. We're going in. The captain's face went pale, and the first officer gripped his seat with white knuckles. But they said nothing. They couldn't speak. They were too terrified, too stunned to do anything but hold on. The man took a deep breath, steadying himself. He focused on the horizon, where the water was now close enough to touch. He felt the heat rising in his chest, the pressure building in his head. It was now or never. He pulled back on the yoke with all his strength, trying to level out the plane as much as possible. The engines roared as they struggled to keep up. The nose of the plane was still angled slightly downward, but there was no time to correct it further. He had done everything he could. The man's voice came again, calm but firm. Brace for impact. Now. The next few seconds felt like hours. The plane screamed through the air, its descent continuing at a terrifying speed. Then, just as the wheels touched the surface of the water, there was a sudden, deafening noise, a violent splash that sent the aircraft lurching forward. The impact sent shockwaves through the plane. Passengers screamed as the aircraft hit the water with brutal force, sending a huge cloud of spray into the air. The world around them seemed to explode in a blur of noise and chaos. The man's grip tightened on the controls, but there was no stopping the inevitable. The plane continued to skim across the water, its belly scraping along the surface as the wind and water battered it from all sides. It felt like the world had tilted sideways, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn in two. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the plane began to slow. The frantic, violent shaking began to ease, and the noise of the engine sputtered and died. The aircraft was still moving, but at a slower, more controlled pace. The water, once threatening, now became a strange, steady rhythm beneath them. The man released his grip on the controls, his heart pounding in his chest. They had done it. Against all odds, they had survived. But they weren't out of danger yet. The plane was still skimming across the water, and they weren't safe. They had to get off the aircraft. The man turned to the two pilots, who were both staring at him in stunned silence. They hadn't spoken a word since the crash. "We need to get to the emergency exits," the man said, his voice firm. "Now." The captain nodded, though his movements were slow. He looked as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. The man stood up, moving toward the emergency hatch. He reached for the door handle and pulled it open, the cool air from the ocean rushing inside. Water had begun to seep into the cabin, slowly filling the floor. They had no time to waste. "Everyone out," the man shouted, his voice ringing with authority. "Now! Get to the life rafts." The first officer, his face pale, nodded and moved toward the rear of the plane. The captain hesitated, but the man gave him a stern look. "Move," he commanded. And with that, the survivors began to evacuate. As the survivors made their way toward the emergency life rafts, the man's mind was racing. They had survived the crash, but they were still stranded in the middle of the ocean. The journey ahead would be long and dangerous. And as the last few people made it to the rafts, a strange sound came from the distance, a sound that didn't belong in the quiet expanse of the sea. A sound that could change everything. The last few passengers scrambled for the emergency rafts, their breaths shallow and desperate, hearts racing. The sea stretched out before them, vast and endless, as if the world had suddenly collapsed into a solitary, uninhabitable expanse. The roar of the wind had quieted, replaced by the eerie sounds of waves gently lapping against the hull of the plane. The man, drenched and exhausted from his ordeal, stood at the door of the plane, his eyes scanning the horizon. The dark water had swallowed up the wreckage, leaving nothing but a few fragments of the aircraft floating in the distance. The plane, once a symbol of human achievement, now lay in ruin, a memory of chaos. But it had served its purpose, and they had survived. Or so he thought. His body ached, his muscles sore from the strain of keeping the plane under control during the final moments of their descent. He had narrowly avoided a disaster, yet another near-death experience that had felt like a lifetime. But now, there was no time for relief. There was no time to rest. They were alive, but stranded. The fight for survival wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. He helped the last passenger into a life raft, his movements mechanical, driven by instinct rather than thought. They were all in shock. No one spoke. The faces of the survivors were pale, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. They had made it through the crash, but they hadn't made it to safety. The ocean wasn't kind, and there was no telling what awaited them in this vast, unknown wilderness. As the man climbed into his own raft, he glanced back at the plane one last time. The fuselage was slowly sinking, the nose of the aircraft dipping below the waterline. It was a final, quiet surrender to the sea, and with it, the last hope of ever recovering any of their belongings. The passengers and crew were now scattered across several rafts, each bobbing gently in the water, pulled in different directions by the current. It was only then that the reality of their situation hit them all. They were alone in the middle of the ocean, with nothing but their wits and the remnants of the plane to survive on. The man took a deep breath and looked at the faces of those around him. Their eyes were filled with questions, questions that no one had the answers to. How long would they be here? Was help coming? Would they survive? There was no way to know. His gaze turned to the first officer, who was now sitting in the raft beside him. The young man's face was a mask of exhaustion and fear, but his eyes were still alert, still looking for direction. "How long can we last out here?" the first officer asked, his voice hoarse from the adrenaline and salt water. "What's the plan?" The man hesitated for a moment, scanning the horizon once again. There was no land in sight, just endless ocean stretching out in all directions. He didn't know how long they could last. They were lucky to have made it this far. Food and fresh water were the first things they needed, and they didn't have much of either. "I don't know," he said quietly. "We take it one day at a time. Find food, find water. We keep moving." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only plan they had. The sea was merciless, and the survivors were at its mercy now. They would need to work together if they wanted to make it through. As the minutes stretched into hours, the mood in the rafts began to shift from shock to quiet desperation. Some passengers fell asleep, exhausted from the crash and the strain of the ordeal. Others simply stared at the endless expanse of water, wondering if anyone would ever come to rescue them. The man sat quietly in his raft, his mind working through every possible scenario. He couldn't stop thinking about the strange noise they had heard just before they abandoned the plane, the one that seemed so out of place in the vast, lonely sea. It had been faint, barely audible, but it had been there, lingering in the air like a warning. Was it just the wind? Or something more? He couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone out here. There was something about the ocean, its stillness, its vastness, that made him uneasy. It was too quiet, too peaceful. The calm before the storm, perhaps. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting an eerie glow across the water. The survivors had settled into a rhythm, though it was a rhythm built on necessity, not comfort. They had no supplies, no equipment. Just the rafts, and the hope that someone would find them before it was too late. The man's mind kept drifting back to the strange sound. He couldn't get it out of his head. He had seen the ocean's power, felt its pull as they skimmed across its surface. But now, in the stillness of the night, it felt as though something else was lurking just beneath the waves, waiting. A sharp cry interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see one of the passengers, a woman in her 40s, pointing out at the horizon. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Do you see that?" she screamed. The man turned quickly, his heart racing. For a moment, his mind couldn't process what he was seeing. It was a shape, a large, dark form rising from the water, moving toward them. It was impossible to tell what it was, but it was big. Too big to be just a ship or a whale. "Get down," the man shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. He grabbed the first officer by the arm and pulled him low in the raft. The other survivors had already begun to panic, scrambling in every direction, but it was too late. Whatever was out there was moving quickly, cutting through the water like a predator stalking its prey. The shape continued to rise out of the ocean, larger now, the surface of the water rippling violently as the object approached. There was a low hum, a deep, vibrating noise that seemed to resonate from the core of the ocean itself. The sound was familiar, like the noise they had heard earlier, but now it was louder, clearer. Then, without warning, the shape broke through the surface, a massive, dark silhouette that towered over them. The survivors gasped in horror as the true size of the object became apparent. It wasn't a ship, a whale, or anything they had ever seen. It was something else. It was enormous, easily the size of a small skyscraper, and it had a shape unlike anything they could comprehend. Its surface gleamed like dark metal, reflecting the faint light of the setting sun. Its structure was jagged, almost unnatural, as though it had been crafted by some intelligence that was beyond human understanding. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air grew still, and all the sounds of the ocean seemed to fade into the background. The man's heart raced, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. His first instinct was to get away, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The ocean surrounded them in every direction, and this thing was coming closer, too close. "What the hell is that?" the first officer whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," the man said, his eyes never leaving the strange shape in the water. "But we're about to find out." Suddenly, a powerful wave surged toward them, knocking the rafts violently to the side. The survivors screamed as they were thrown into the cold water. The man gripped the side of his raft, trying to keep himself afloat. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of something else, movement in the water, just beneath the surface. It was fast, sleek, and there were several of them. Whatever had just emerged from the ocean, it wasn't alone. The cold water crashed against the survivors, throwing them into a state of chaos. They had barely been able to hold on to the rafts when the massive wave hit. Panic swept through the group like a contagion as the dark shape from the ocean loomed overhead, casting a long shadow across the water. A strange, unsettling vibration seemed to ripple through the air, accompanied by a deep, low hum that sent shivers down their spines. The man clung to the edge of his raft, his eyes fixed on the unnatural silhouette rising from the water. The thing was enormous, far too big to be a natural creature. It wasn't a whale, it wasn't a ship, and it certainly wasn't anything they had ever seen before. He could feel his pulse racing, the fear creeping into his chest, but there was no room for panic now. The survivors needed him. They needed direction, and they needed hope. "Get back on the rafts," he shouted, his voice cutting through the panic like a knife. "Now!" The first officer, struggling to stay afloat, was the first to hear the man's voice and scramble back onto his raft. He gasped for breath, his face white with shock, but he nodded in understanding. The other survivors were in worse shape, tossed about in the turbulent water, their screams echoing through the air. The man turned toward them, his eyes scanning the sea for any sign of the massive shape that had emerged. It was still there, rising slowly from the depths like a colossal, dark entity. Its surface gleamed faintly, reflecting the weak light of the sinking sun. The hum was getting louder now, vibrating through the air and sending a deep tremor into the water. Whatever it was intelligent, purposeful. And it was coming closer. "Come on. Get to the rafts," the man yelled again, his voice more desperate this time. One of the women, a passenger who had been knocked into the water, managed to grab hold of the side of the raft. She was trembling, her face pale with fear, but she pulled herself up, her hands slick with water. The man reached out to help her, pulling her up with all his strength. She didn't speak, only nodded in gratitude as she collapsed onto the raft beside him. The others were still struggling in the water, their movements slow and disoriented. The man's gaze flickered back to the dark shape as it drew nearer. The closer it came, the more unnatural it looked. It was too perfectly symmetrical, its surface too smooth, like it was crafted with intention. No ship, no animal in the ocean, could have created such an impossible shape. The wave that had knocked them into the water was now dissipating, but the ocean still seemed restless. The vibrations from the mysterious entity were growing stronger, and the water around them rippled in strange patterns. As the survivors managed to drag themselves back into the rafts, the man's mind raced. There was something wrong here, something he couldn't explain. "Where's the other raft?" one of the survivors asked, her voice panicked. The man quickly scanned the horizon. There were only 3 rafts left, and one of them was gone. Had it drifted off? Had someone abandoned it? Or had it been taken by whatever force was out there in the water? The first officer, sitting beside him, looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. "What is that thing?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening hum. The man's lips tightened as he looked back at the massive shape. He didn't know, but he felt an instinctual dread that gnawed at him. It wasn't natural. It didn't belong here. And whatever it was, it wasn't friendly. "We need to stay together," the man said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to stick together and figure this out. We can't survive out here alone." The survivors, still dazed, nodded slowly, clinging to their rafts. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with fear. Everyone was waiting for something, waiting for an explanation, or for the inevitable next wave of terror. And then, the humming stopped. Suddenly, the ocean fell eerily silent. The waves ceased their rolling, the wind dropped, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire world had paused. It was a strange, unsettling quiet that sent chills down the man's spine. He looked around, his instincts on high alert. Something was coming. And then, it happened. A low, guttural sound, like a growl or a roar, ripped through the stillness of the ocean. It was deafening, far more menacing than anything they had ever heard before. The survivors flinched, their hands clutched desperately to the sides of their rafts, their eyes wide with terror. The man's heart pounded in his chest as he looked up. The massive shape had fully emerged from the ocean now. It was larger than any creature he had ever seen, dwarfing the rafts and the survivors below it. But it wasn't a creature. Not in the traditional sense. It was something else entirely. The surface of the object shifted, and then the man saw it, a massive opening, dark and swirling, like a vortex in the center of the shape. It was almost as though the thing itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with energy. It moved again, slowly, deliberately, and the sound of the growl grew louder. But there was no mistaking it now, the object wasn't just moving toward them. It was reaching out. The first officer stood up, his eyes wide with disbelief. It's coming for us." The man's mind raced. They were too exposed, too vulnerable out here in the open. If they didn't act quickly, they would be dragged into whatever nightmare was waiting inside that massive shape. He had to think, had to act. But the survivors were still panicking, some of them screaming as they huddled together in their rafts. "Listen to me," the man shouted. His voice cut through the panic, and for a brief moment, the survivors fell silent. "We need to get out of its path. Move. Now." But it was too late. The growl deepened, almost as if the ocean itself was responding to the force. And then the water surged. The ocean seemed to come alive, moving with a force far greater than anything the survivors had ever experienced. Waves taller than buildings crashed down on them, their rafts being tossed like leaves in the wind. The man was thrown to the side, his body crashing into the cold water once again. He gasped for air as he was submerged. His mind spinning, his vision a blur. His hands reached for the surface, trying to pull himself back up, but the waves were relentless. Each second felt like an eternity as the current pulled him further away from the raft. But then, a sudden force gripped his arm, pulling him upward. It was the first officer. Despite the chaos, he had managed to grab the man and pull him back toward the raft. "Get on," the first officer shouted, his voice straining with effort. The man managed to latch onto the edge of the raft, and the first officer helped him back into it. They were both soaked, shivering from the cold and exhaustion. But they didn't have time to recover. The shape was still looming, its growl vibrating through the ocean, and the water was beginning to churn with more intensity than ever. The survivors huddled together in their rafts, the panic returning in full force. The man's mind raced. There was no way they could survive out here for much longer, not with that thing hunting them. They needed to escape. They needed to get away from whatever this thing was. But how? The answer came to him then, a terrifying realization. Whatever it wasn't just after them. It was hunting. And the ocean wasn't big enough to hide them from it. The dark shape in the water loomed closer, its mass blocking out the last rays of the sinking sun. It had grown larger, towering over the survivors in the rafts, casting a deep, cold shadow over everything. The water had become a battlefield, waves crashing violently against the survivors, each one struggling to hold on, trying desperately to keep their rafts intact. The growl from the entity reverberated through the air, shaking the very core of their beings. Whatever it wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was alive. It was hunting them. The man, his heart hammering in his chest, glanced around. Panic had set in fully now. The survivors, though exhausted, were still trying to stay calm. They had to. There was no time to waste, no time to question what was happening. Survival was the only thing that mattered. His eyes flicked toward the first officer, whose face was grim, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and terror. "We need to get away from it," the man shouted, his voice barely carrying over the deafening noise of the growl. He could see the fear in the first officer's eyes, the same fear reflected in the faces of the other survivors. There was no easy way out. Every option seemed more dangerous than the last. But then, as if responding to their desperation, the entity shifted again. The growl deepened, then, suddenly, stopped. The ocean was eerily quiet once more, as though holding its breath. The survivors, still clinging to their rafts, didn't know whether to take the silence as a sign of hope or something worse. The man's mind was spinning, each thought coming faster than the next. He could sense something was coming, something bigger than just survival. They had to face whatever was out there. They had no choice. The ocean had trapped them, and the entity that had risen from its depths was not merely a random event. It was deliberate, calculated. Then, it happened. A low rumble echoed from below them, and the ocean surged, pushing them into disarray. The man's raft tilted dangerously, water sloshing over the sides as he clung to the edge. He fought to regain his balance, heart racing, as the shape that had been haunting them began to move again, this time faster, closing the gap between them. "No," the first officer screamed. "It's coming for us." The man's gaze darted toward the others, all of whom were scrambling, panic-stricken, to stay on their rafts. Some had already begun to break apart under the pressure of the waves, the survivors clinging to the wreckage of their rafts, doing their best to stay afloat. The chaos intensified. But amid all the confusion, the man suddenly understood something important. It wasn't just the entity itself that was hunting them. The waves, the storm, the violent water, they were all connected. This wasn't just an attack. It was a message. The ocean, vast and unexplored, was responding to them. To their presence. For the first time in his life, the man understood what it meant to be insignificant in the face of nature's true power. It was as though the ocean had made its decision. It was going to test them, challenge them, force them to prove that they were worthy of survival. His eyes narrowed. They couldn't just wait and hope for rescue. They had to fight back, but not with violence. Not with strength. They needed to use their minds. "We need to get close to the entity," the man shouted, his voice rising above the panic. He saw the confusion in the first officer's eyes. "Trust me. We need to get closer to it." The first officer hesitated, clearly afraid of getting any closer to the looming shape. "Are you crazy?" he spat. "That thing is going to..." "Listen," the man cut him off, his eyes locking onto the first officer's. "This isn't about running away. The ocean is trying to test us. It wants to see if we're going to fight, or if we're going to give up. We don't know what that thing is, but we're not going to survive out here by hiding." The first officer's eyes flickered with understanding, and for a brief moment, he seemed to come to terms with the man's words. "What do we do?" The man swallowed hard, his heart still pounding. "We get close to it. We get close, and we find out what it wants. But we need to stay together. All of us." The survivors, still in disbelief, glanced nervously at each other. But as the man's words hung in the air, they seemed to steady themselves. The uncertainty was palpable, but so was the sense that they had no choice but to follow this strange plan. They paddled toward the looming entity, each stroke of the paddle feeling like a leap into the unknown. As they got closer, the vibrations from the thing became even more pronounced, filling the air with a deep, almost otherworldly hum. The water churned violently beneath them, but the man kept his focus on the entity, his heart steady despite the chaos around him. The shape grew larger still. As they approached, the survivors could see something new. At the center of the dark mass, there was an opening, an intricate, swirling vortex that seemed to pulse with energy, almost like a heartbeat. It was as though the entity was alive. The man couldn't understand what it was, but one thing was certain: it wasn't trying to kill them. It was trying to communicate. The survivors, now within range of the entity, fell into an uneasy silence. They had no idea what to do, no idea how to make sense of the situation. But as they floated there, caught in the magnetic pull of the entity's presence, a strange feeling of calm washed over the man. The growl that had shaken them to their core now softened into a quiet hum, a sound almost melodic in nature. It was then that the man realized the truth: the entity wasn't a monster. It was something far older, far wiser, than anything they had ever encountered. It was a part of the ocean itself, a guardian of the deep. And it had been testing them. As the survivors continued to watch, something extraordinary happened. The vortex at the center of the entity's shape began to swirl faster, and with it, the water around them seemed to change. The ocean was no longer the violent, chaotic force it had been just moments before. It had settled into a strange calm, and the waves grew gentler, more rhythmic. The man's eyes widened as he watched the vortex. It was as though the ocean itself had been waiting for them to reach this point, for them to prove their will to survive. And now, it was offering them a choice: to fight or to accept the ocean's mystery, to become a part of something greater. Slowly, the man extended his hand toward the vortex. It seemed to draw him in, beckoning him closer. He could feel the power of the ocean deep within him, urging him to take a step forward. He hesitated for only a moment, then made his decision. He reached into the vortex. The moment his hand touched the swirling energy, a flood of images washed over him, visions of the ocean's depths, of ancient creatures, of lost civilizations, of storms and calm seas alike. He could feel the heartbeat of the ocean, feel its pulse within his own body. And with that, he understood. He understood the ocean's secret. The survivors watched in awe as the man's hand glowed briefly with a soft blue light, the light of the ocean itself. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a force to destroy, it was something else entirely. The ocean was offering them its wisdom, its strength, and its blessing. And with that blessing, the storms began to subside. The water grew calm, the violent waves receding into peaceful ripples. They had passed the test. The ocean had seen their will to survive and had granted them its gift. The man pulled his hand back from the vortex, and the entity began to sink slowly back into the depths, its form dissolving into the ocean's dark surface. The growl faded, replaced by a peaceful silence, and the survivors stared in stunned silence at the now tranquil sea. We made it," the first officer whispered, his voice trembling. The man nodded slowly, his heart still racing, but now with relief. "Yes. We did." As the survivors floated there, the final lesson of the journey became clear: survival wasn't just about the will to live. It was about understanding the forces that shaped the world around them, about respecting the unknown, and about facing their deepest fears. And so, they were not just survivors. They were witnesses to something extraordinary, something they would never forget. As the survivors were eventually rescued by a passing ship, they carried with them the understanding that the world is full of mysteries, some of which are not meant to be understood, but only experienced. The ocean, with all its power and mystery, had granted them a second chance. And for that, they would be forever grateful. The mystery of the deep ocean would remain, a reminder of the secrets it holds and the trials it places before those who dare to venture into its depths.